Hey, good morning, guys. As promised, I'm going to push out a video to you guys here relative to the subject of gambling, and this will cover our note section in it for our class on sport law and ethics, and this will cover it. So, uh, I'm going to take probably about 20 minutes and kind of run through the PowerPoint here and a couple of videos we're going to watch, and ultimately overview of gambling in the sport world, and then hopefully a little bit of a viewpoint, Christian worldview as believers, how we navigate this as we work through it. Give you a quick, I want you to know that this is indeed me. There we go. All right, I'm back out. So coming at you live from the home office here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is the voice of Penn State football, Scott Huckabee. Always wanted to say that. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in and ultimately kind of work through this. And then if this generates any questions, feel free to email me. I will just make sure you guys had the opportunity to see this when we get back together next week. And if there's any questions or discussion, I think we can handle that through our class. So without further ado, we're going to jump in. I got kind of a screenshot here from a website that I spent some time on called EDJ Analytics, and kind of an interesting thing. And I don't think anybody would argue that gambling and betting on sports is not a really big deal. And just historically, first, just kind of looking through a little bit of the history. See if we can get this thing moving here. Um, Going to watch a quick video. This is from the Michigan Department of Community Health, a branch of our state government. And I did a little investigating, and this particular line item, they spend about $2 million a year. Not all on gambling, but that's certainly a part of what they do. And ultimately, they're trying to gauge the health within communities in the state of Michigan. And as one of the things that they're going to attack is the potential problem of gambling. And this one's a little corny, but I just wanted to capture one just so you understand the importance that even our state, in a secular mindset, have placed upon the dangers of gambling.
Oh, good. I don't care what it's called. It won't be there.
When you have a gambling problem, the person you are robbing is yourself. Get your life back. Call the Michigan Problem Gambling Helpline for free professional confidential help.
So I don't think that's up for any Academy Awards or anything, but I think you get the idea and the picture. Again, that our state has recognized that gambling is addictive, and it can be certainly can be a problem, and plenty of public service announcements along those lines are out there, and they spend the time, energy, and obviously the money to raise awareness. So, like in a marriage situation or in a family situation, if you need help, there's a hotline that you can call, and or a spouse or someone, a loved one, can call and hopefully get some help and some counseling services and so forth. So, just quick overview, introduction. Gambling is not a new thing, and goes way back in our country's history and so forth. And gambling on the outcome of games would be considered by some a form of cheating. Pete Rose, the whole baseball piece with him and not getting into the Hall of Fame has been front and center relative to him gambling on baseball while he was involved in the game. So, and as you know, the media certainly perpetuates this whole mindset of producing and putting out there the statistics relative to games. If you watch the Michigan State Maryland game on Saturday evening, you could very quickly find what the point spread was, what the over under was, and opportunities to be able to place bets on that game. And obviously, the Spartans beat the spread by, I mean, they were not projected to win that game, and they certainly went down to Maryland and won by double digits. I can't remember what the exact final score was, but I think it was 12 or 14 points. So, kind of an interesting thing. But the media does have a role in this, in that by producing those statistics, kind of given a nod to it being okay, and it's really not that big of a deal and part of the whole landscape in sports. I think it's important to know in recent years and historically that betting on professional sports, players themselves can't be engaged in gambling. They can't associate with gamblers, and that there's guidelines and repercussions within each of the leagues relative to that. So even the leagues have recognized that there's some ethical lines that players and those associated with professional sports should not cross relative to gambling and betting. Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, and we're going to watch another video here. This is really fascinating, and I guess I'm going to ask you to think through this. He obviously is not looking at it from a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview. He's looking at it strictly from the notion that gambling is out there. It's been happening for many years. Let's legalize it. And he's kind of been one of the first commissioners that has come out and said that. Let's legalize it. Let's bring it into the light. Certainly, there's financial benefit he would like to see as well for the NBA in terms of their intellectual property and so forth. And you'll see through this video, he kind of recognizes that there's a lot of bad things in gambling, but I think he kind of downplays it and minimizes it a little bit. Let's watch this video and then we'll keep pushing through this here.
One of the many things that I admire about you is your open-mindedness to things that previously it felt like no one wanted to touch. Of the commissioners, I feel like you were the first one who was willing to start really talking about gambling, legalizing gambling in this country in a meaningful way. And now we're seeing others following suit. So we've seen this lately we saw the NFL and the Major League Baseball and their involvement with DraftKings and FanDuel and all of that. Where do you think that we stand with that, and where do you feel we are in the possibility of seeing legalized gambling in this country and the NBA's role in it?
Right. So, of course, we have legalized gambling in Las Vegas.
Right.
I mean, there's sports books, so it happens in pockets. There's a few other exceptions to a national prohibition on sports betting. But so several years ago, when I first became commissioner, and that's my position was, there's, in addition to a small pocket of legalized gambling, we know there's an enormous amount of illegal sports betting in the United States. I mean, estimates go up to $400 billion a year for all sports. So my feeling was, let's make it transparent, let's regulate it. We had an issue in the NBA some number of years ago with an official, but there was no transparency into it. I mean, now you look at jurisdictions in Europe, for example, people are betting with credit cards, so they know exactly who it is, they know how much they're betting. It's just like a stock market with insider trading. If there's aberrational behavior, sophisticated computer programs spit it out and say there's something going on, at least that you should investigate. So my view is, it should be regulated. My preference would be a consistent national federal framework in the United States, but it so happens that the state of New Jersey challenged the constitutionality of the federal ban. It's a law called PASPA that makes it illegal virtually everywhere. And that case was argued before the Supreme Court in December. It will be decided any day. That the term of the Supreme Court ends at the end of June. So sometime in the next 2 months or so, we're going to get an opinion. And that what we're hearing is that it's highly likely, the experts are saying it's highly likely the federal statute will be overturned, which means it's then up to the states. So in anticipation of that case being overturned, almost 20 states are now actively considering legalized sports betting. And so we've joined the fray and sort of gone out there, and we have a position. We think we should be compensated in certain ways for the additional costs we're going to incur through various integrity measures. But on top of that, our league, just the NBA alone, will spend $7.5 billion this year creating this content. So our feeling as the intellectual property creators, we should be compensated as well. And so, but there are also issues on downside. I mean, I'm trying to be more realist here rather than say I think it's great for people to bet on sports. I know it'll lead to additional engagement, but there's problem gamblers too, and those are all things we need to address. But to your point, other leagues have joined in. Rob Manfred, Commissioner of Baseball, has been very outspoken on this issue as well, and I know the other leagues are studying it closely.
Look, the NFL just moved a team, or is moving a team to Vegas, and so that sort of taboo has never been there. And I've never understood the integrity piece of that. isn't it more likely, and maybe I'm not smart enough to figure this out, but isn't it more likely that you would have issues with gambling that was kept under the covers where no one knows what's going on than it would be if you're talking about the integrity of your sport? More likely you'd have a problem with that than you would if everything was out in the
No,
sunlight.
but precisely, and in fact, in European soccer, in the old days, they used to have those betting parlors in London. You'd see on the streets, and you go in, and people would bet in essence in cash, and there were betting windows at soccer stadiums, just like at a horse track. You could go up and place a bet, and most of those windows are now closed because they want people to bet with their credit cards. They want people to do it with their smartphones because then there's complete transparency into it. So I'm where you are. I mean, if you go to Google now and you put in Bet NFL or Bet NBA, there are literally thousands of sites that are technically illegal, but seemingly hundreds of thousands of people are willing to put their credit cards in, but there's no access to that data for the league, so we can't trace what's going on there. And again, think of a legal stock market. Again, there's complete transparency into all the buying and selling and all the transactions, and that's what we think should happen.
Someday we will look back on this and say, I can't believe that this wasn't legal at one point, because it just makes all the sense in the world. One of the many things.
So to me, it's really interesting. Couple of takeaways from that video, and you can hear it at the end. The interviewer from ESPN was, I've forgotten his name, but he says, hey, there's going to be a time when we look back at this and say, hey, we cannot believe that betting hasn't always been a part of this, and it makes complete sense. So, the verdict has been made in that court of opinion, and certainly from a practical standpoint, they make some valid points. Like right now, it's happening and it's all kind of under the table and in the darkness. Let's bring it into the light. Let's have transparency. He alluded to the official that was throwing games and betting on games in the NBA, Tim McConaughey, I think his name is, and let's bring this into the light. And then making comparisons to, it's just like trading stocks on the stock market, which there are some really specific differences in that realm. Just the big one that comes to mind is when you're trading stocks, you're actually purchasing something. You have an asset. You're a part of that company, albeit small. You are a decision maker, and you're a part. You've bought ownership, a small part of ownership within a company. Whereas in betting, you're just putting money out there that has no affiliation or ties. You're just putting money out there, and then ultimately, as we get further down in this lecture, we're going to try to take a step back away from the practical, pragmatic side of gambling, and rather than say, yeah, it's happening, and we should just bring it into the light and try to regulate it, because ultimately Adam Silver and some of the other commissioners, they're looking for revenue, and he mentioned that. They're spending millions of dollars on the intellectual property each year to, in his case, the NBA, and they want a return on investment in that. So in a practical sense, I think it makes a level of sense to be able to argue that position, but in the grand scheme, is there wisdom in it is probably the question mark. And I think from a Christian worldview, we really have to pause, hit the pause button, and scan back a little bit and say, all right, is this really good for people? Is this good for our society as a whole? Because historically, they have shown that it's not a good thing, and it's an addictive behavior and so forth. And I'm going to show my cards a little bit early and say, show my cards. I'm going to show my cards early and say, I don't think it's a good thing. And I think we really have to exercise caution as we navigate it as believers and so forth. You can see here that the fantasy sport world has ramped this up significantly, and these statistics are kind of in North America here, U.S. and Canada, and you can see the trends are moving upward in terms of people who are involved in fantasy sport, and ultimately the gambling context of that as well. Revenues somewhere, and this is all a little bit of speculation because it's not been legalized, it's not been regulated, and so forth. But anywhere from $160 billion up over $200 billion. I think Adam Silver even referenced $400 billion. So a little bit scary when you're talking about numbers that big and the differential between the low end and the high end. They really don't know, but they certainly recognize that there's a lot of dollar signs flying through all of this world of gambling and so forth. And while these slides aren't ridiculously important per se, it's just showing the increase and the significance in fantasy sports and how that's being tied into gambling as well. So, and as you well know, the Adam Silver video was just on the threshold or the eve of a decision from the Supreme Court, which now we know has gone through, and now sport betting is legalized. And it's not a federal law at this point, but they've overturned a federal law. But now it's up to the individual states. So as you can imagine, states are looking at, hey, there's revenue here that we can, and it's taxable revenue. We are going to be able to make money, and we're going to get people to spend money in our states. So it's going to increase revenues, and ultimately we're going to be able to tax that money and also increase our revenue in that way. So they're jumping on board like crazy. So Michigan's the 19th state in our union to have legalized betting. You can see on this map here all of the full-scale legalized sports betting in red. You can see Michigan recent bill has been passed and the number of states, but it's coming, and it's coming quickly across our nation. So ultimately, we have to kind of think through, how do we navigate this as believers? I think I mentioned this site already, but there are sites out there. Professor Degner went to a football coaching clinic here a week or so ago and met with these guys, and this EDJ analytics group. They're using strictly numbers and ultimately decision-making processes, and not just in sport. I'm going to flip over to their website here real quick. Just quick side note, I meant to flip to this earlier, but this is the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services I mentioned earlier, and you can see on the website, and this is state of Michigan, the biggest at-risk target in Michigan, like at this point, is actually senior citizens, and I think we will see that demographic change as sport betting is now allowed, and I don't see grandmas and grandpas like wholesale betting on sports. I see them sitting at casinos and so forth, but I think we'll probably see those demographics change. But has your gambling become a problem? Women, men, teens, and children, and I think they've obviously put a lot of efforts and a lot of resources into making sure we understand the dangers of gambling. But yet, we speak out of both sides of our mouths because we generally like the revenue that it creates, but we also, it's like the tobacco companies that are putting out anti-smoking ads. By law, they're required to, but they're also, people are smoking and becoming addicted to smoking, and they're obviously benefiting in a huge way. But kind of wink, wink, nod type of, yeah, it's bad for you, and we're going to put out these public service announcements because we feel the moral obligation to kind of do that. So that being said, so I think I mentioned it earlier, but the game on Saturday, Michigan State, they ended up winning by 12 points. You can see it here. But the spread on the game was at Maryland, and they will run these scenarios, thousands, hundreds and thousands of scenarios, and they will help them come up. Computers will run them, and they will, quote unquote, play that game and play it out and see, through different scenarios of what happens. So ultimately, Maryland was a 2-point favorite in this game. You can see over here, the over-under total points scored in the game was 138. They obviously exceeded that. Going into this game, Maryland was undefeated at home, 23 and were they 5 and or whatever, 23 and 5 or 23 and 4 going into that game. Hadn't lost at home, so they were clearly the favorite. And Sparty came in and kind of punched him in the mouth and broke the odds, if you will. So I'm confident that some people lost some significant amounts of money on this game because they played the odds, if you will. And so this EDJ analytics, you can see here, they kind of ran their simulations, and they had in that game Maryland winning it basically 2 out of 3 times, 66% of the time they had Maryland winning it. And they actually have these tools without even having to pay for the site yet or a free trial. You can kind of do some of the, for this game, it was a 66% versus 34%. And then you start hitting the tabs going up. Like for Maryland to win by 1, it was a 63%, 2 was a 60%, and so forth. You can go down the line. So the odds of Maryland winning by 12 in that game were down to 23%. and you can slide it the other direction and kind of see some of the analytics of that. And people will be using these to quote unquote make informed bets on sports, and perfectly legal now. So that being said, it's just interesting stuff. And this group, this EDJ, they're ultimately using analytics on decision making, similar to we talked even about people making decisions in baseball. Cybermetrics is a real thing, and back in the day, they would have people travel around and watch potential players and see them throw the ball, particularly in pitching or hitting and so forth, and start making decisions about, is this a guy we want to draft? Is this a guy we want to try to pick up, and so forth. And now sabermetrics has entered into the realm of data and information, and using all sorts of analytics in order to navigate decision making. And these people are doing the same thing. They're doing it in healthcare, they're doing it in education, they're obviously doing it in sports, and data driven decisions. So, kind of an interesting thing. We're going to quickly buzz through these. I mentioned earlier that the major leagues, and football, baseball, hockey, in basketball, all of them have statutes or guidelines within their bylaws about the dangers of gambling within their sport. And baseball's here. You can see the NFL has what they call the integrity clause. Ties into gambling, ties into things like filming other franchises. As we saw with the New England Patriots, Deflategate, all of those types of things are covered under this integrity clause in the NFL. Kind of an interesting thing. Total side note, I read somewhere online that there's movement with replacing the NBA logo to Kobe, which was they have 3 million signatures from what I read about already in place, trying to overturn the current guy, Jerry West, who, as I understand, and I did some reading, is really indifferent to his image being used anymore. And it'll be an interesting thing to see if ultimately, with the recent tragic death of Kobe, if that will be something that they overturn. Kind of an interesting thing. So that's why I threw that image in there. But just understanding all four of the big leagues have pieces in place in their bylaws and their constitution relative to gambling and the dangers and the consequences, rather, of players or people involved in the organizations if they are gambling within their league. So as you know, in 2018, that did get overturned, as Adam Silver mentioned in that video, that it was imminent, and certainly it did. And so that opened the door for the states to jump into sports gambling, and Michigan is no exception to that as well. And so this was the legislation. Ultimately, it was New Jersey versus the NCAA. State of New Jersey wanted to legalize gambling, similar to the way it is in Nevada. And the Supreme Court did ultimately rule in that favor. This PASPA that Adam Silver mentioned, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which basically made gambling on sports illegal, and that now has been overturned, and the proverbial floodgates have opened. Just now we want to, as I mentioned at the beginning, let's take a step back and from a Christian worldview, forget about the pragmatic or the practical side of it. Yeah, there's gambling and there's a lot of money and they're doing it anyway. Let's bring it into the light. Let's generate revenue for states. Let's generate revenue for the big four leagues and all of those things from strictly a financial perspective, but philosophically, ethically, morally, how should we view this as Christians? And again, as I shared, you'll see a bit of my conservative bent relative to it. And as we look at some passages of scripture and just kind of our worldview and think about that. So I found an article on Focus on the Family, which I think is a very reputable group, a pretty conservative group in relation to gambling. And here were some of the main points that they threw out for us to consider and to think through. One of the greatest commandments in Scripture is love your neighbor as yourself. And the nature of gambling makes that very difficult to do, because with gambling there's a winner and a loser. If I win, you lose, or vice versa. And ultimately, can I really live out? Can I live into this piece of scripture, this passage of scripture, if I'm gambling? And again, when we kind of define gambling, I'm talking about wholesale gambling. I'm not talking about, hey, you got a friend and you put your names into a March Madness pool and everybody pitches in $5 type of deal. I don't think that's the wholesale issue and problem here. We're talking about wholesale gambling, addictive gambling, and doing it consistently and with high stakes, if you will. The second piece, Proverbs 14:21, whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed is he who is generous to the poor. I think it's important for us to recognize those groups that are targeted relative to gambling, and the groups that are probably the most susceptible are people that are in financial straits, challenges. We already mentioned the elderly and so forth. And I just think it's important for us to recognize Scripture would compel us to make sure that we're taking care of the poor. And if you can, the statistic here found that people with incomes of 10,000, less than 10,000 are the ones that are spending the most money on lottery tickets than any other group, as an example. So I just think it's important for us to recognize and understand that the groups that are the most susceptible and the most at risk are the ones that we're commanded in Scripture to make sure that we're taking care of. So how can we justify sports betting, sports gambling, or gambling in general relative to that? Number 3, Proverbs 12:11. Those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense. And I think Scripture, I don't think it's hard to tie in that gambling is an easy way, potentially, or the risk of trying to make money without actually working for it kind of flies in the face of our work ethic that Scripture would speak specifically to. This relationship of our faith and our work. And ultimately, our work is a way to bring worship back to God as the Creator and the gifts that He's given us. And kind of gambling supersedes this whole process of worship and work as worship back to God. Number 4, 1 Timothy 6. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and into trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. All right, and I think this is tying into greed and covetousness, and how can we justify what we are doing through gambling relative to a passage like this. The love of money, and it's not money that's evil, but it's certainly the love of money and wanting more and finding shortcuts to be able to get there. Number 5, and just 2 more here, and we're going to wrap this up. But stewardship, I think if you were to listen to any of, I call them the big 3, but you got Dave Ramsey, you have Larry Burkett, and Ron Blue, who Cornerstone is affiliated with Ron Blue. But these are Christian financial planners, financial managers, and stewardship is obviously a huge part of that. And if we're just not stewarding our money appropriately for kingdom work and for providing for our families and all of those things, I think it's hard to justify gambling in that context as well. And as we think about the parable of the talents, what God gives us, it's our responsibility to steward and to manage with wisdom and with kingdom notions and concepts in mind. I think that's important. So final thought, state-sanctioned gambling, I think, and again, I've shown my cards, is a travesty that it overturns the God-ordained purpose of government. And I think, again, as I shared, there's a sense of talking out of both sides of our mouths. We're going to put out public service announcements and commercials and so forth about the dangers of gambling and the addictive behavior of gambling, but yet we still allow it. And ultimately, the gain is financial gain, and potentially preying on the poor, the elderly, or anybody, even the young. I think can be highly susceptible, and I think it's it's breaking with the whole notion that government is here to protect the welfare and citizens and of its citizenry, and ultimately to suppress evil. And I think if the secular world, the worlds that we live in, the society that we live in, if they recognize the danger of gambling, we ought to step back, pause, and really think through it. Is this something that, as believers, we should be engaged with, and so forth? Um, so I think at the end of the day, you know where I stand, and I think you know the dangers of it, and I think that's been well documented. And as we think about a perspective and a viewpoint as believers on the morals and the ethics of gambling, I think it's really hard to justify, and something for us to really consider, because I think the waters can get deep pretty quickly. And there's always that notion that, hey, this next transaction or this next thing is going to get me on the right path, and I'm ultimately going to change the direction the ship is going, and so forth. And that's ultimately this downward spiral that I think gambling can take us into. So there's kind of our overview and concept of gambling as we think about it as believers. And this will close the notes on this section. And again, as we get back next week, we'll take some time to just briefly discuss and ask some questions relative to this. Alrighty. Hey, have a great afternoon.